All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the CEID Summer Series webinar. Our featured topic today is sensory integration and self-regulation. First, some housekeeping. We're going to have this presented as a fireside chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or, and then our development department will get them to me. The webinar is being recorded. It will be reposted later on our YouTube page and on our website. Okay. So first, on behalf of CEID, I'd like to welcome Leslie Davis. She is a licensed occupational therapist with 25 years experience working in pediatrics. Ms. Davis specializes in the treatment of children who are experiencing differences in how they use sensory information. Today, she's here to share some of her experience and expertise in the world of sensory. So welcome, Leslie.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Shawn.
Great. So let's get started. Everyone knows about the five senses. We've all learned about this in grade school, but can you explain a little bit more about what you mean when we hear the word sensory and what systems are involved?
So happily, and I'm going to start by sharing, and I'm hoping, is that a nice share? Is everybody seeing that? Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to read along and make sure it looks like it.
Okay,
Go ahead and share.
So I'll share here, and then this one should nicely open.
Okay.
Okay, are we seeing that?
Yes.
Great. So yes, so when we talk about our senses, it's interesting because in elementary school we learn, as you all will remember, that we have five senses. We have our visual, our sense of sight, our sense of touch, our sense of smell, our sense of hearing, and our sense of taste. We don't learn about two very important sensory systems that we have a lot of respect for in terms of the occupational therapy perspective as it relates to self-regulation. Those two systems are the vestibular system and the proprioceptive system. The vestibular system is our system that gives us our sense of balance and our spatial orientation. It's actually the system that brings us up against gravity. So when an infant is lying on its tummy and it lifts its little head and then it brings itself up into a sit, that is the vestibular system activating. It gives us our resting muscle tone, our resting muscle energy, and it provides us with our balance and where we are in space. The proprioceptive system is a system of sensory receptors that are in the muscles and in the joints and in the tendons. And those receptors tell us where our joints are in relation to other joints, to the trunk, and provide us with our body awareness. So the vestibular system, our sense of balance, our movement system, the proprioceptive system, our body awareness system work together to really allow us to fluidly move through our environment and have efficient motor planning. We also have great respect for these two systems because as we talk today, we're going to be talking about self-regulation, and we're going to be understanding that these systems play a key role in our ability to self-regulate. So when we talk about sensory integration, we hear this a lot, and what we're really talking about is the organization of sensation for adaptive use. So we're talking about how the different sensory systems, our visual system, our auditory, our oral, our movement systems that we're talking about now, that vestibular and that proprioceptive system, they integrate for us to have functional outcomes. So a nice example would be if we think about the toddler whose visual system has integrated with the proprioceptive and the vestibular system, our movement system, our body awareness system. Those three systems have integrated to allow that toddler to navigate around a coffee table instead of crashing into it. So those three systems we would happily say that have now integrated for functional outcomes in terms of motor planning. And I just gave you a quote, Jean Ayres, who is our guru in the occupational therapy world, our guru who really is the one who did the deepest dive into sensory integration, nicely asks us to think about sensation flowing into the brain the way streams flow into a lake. And I always thought that was a useful image. So when we're talking about the integration of those sensory systems, ideally, the outcome is going to be regulation. And that is our state of optimal arousal, emotional and behavioral outcomes that matches the environmental demand. So we're thinking about an optimal arousal for a child to be able to navigate an amusement park they're about to enter, or an optimal arousal to move into a sleep state at the end of the day. So when we talk about regulation, we're talking about that optimal arousal for balanced level of alertness, balanced emotion, and balanced behavioral outcomes. An infant is not able to manage their own regulation. An infant depends on co-regulation. So the infant depends on the caregiver to provide the regulatory input. And so when we go to an infant who's distressed and we pat the infant's back or rub the head or replace the pacifier or we reposition the body, we're giving the message of regulation to that infant. And we're actually modeling regulatory tools because that infant will come to learn that the sound of the parent's footsteps or the parent's face or the caregiver's face appearing over the child is an indicator that co-regulation is going to start. So even at this very young age, we're supporting that journey into self-regulation. We believe that by about 5 years old, between 5 and 6 year old, our little ones are starting to manage self-regulation. Self-regulation is the ability to monitor and manage our energy states or our level of alertness, our level of presentness, our emotions and our thoughts and behaviors, which we consider outcomes. We consider those outcomes of an optimal arousal state. Then we will have balanced emotions, balanced thoughts, and balanced behaviors, and balanced response to sensory stimuli. I wanted to take a minute to talk about a program that I've used throughout my career that has been a very useful tool for me in terms of communicating with parents, educators, and children. It's called the Alert Program for Self-Regulation. How does your engine run? You may have heard of it, but it just offers this very simple model. It teaches, again, adults and children that we have something inside of our body. It's our nervous system, but we equate it to the engine in a car. And we teach the children and the adults that this engine in the car, just like the engine in our body, just like an engine in a car, can run low sometimes and can run high sometimes. But ideally, we'll want that engine to be running just right. And we want to keep it running just right because early on, we start talking about how much harder it is to get back to a just right place. And that just right place is self-regulation. To get back to that place if we get out of our nicely regulated state. So we talk about trying to keep ourselves in that just right place by using tools, by using sensory tools. And we can talk more about that. So again, what I really invite caregivers and educators and parents to think about is, can we, when we're supporting the child's self-regulation, how do we help them maintain a regulated state versus getting back to a regulated state? So I really emphasize that it's much easier to maintain than regain a just right engine. So it's something that I will be talking about when we're pursuing how do we maintain self-regulation in our children. So the first thing that I would ask us to do before we start talking about, well, what are the sensory tools? What are the regulatory tools that we might use to support regulation? The first thing I do before we even start talking about that is I ask the adults to start thinking about what the sensory environment is, looking through this sensory lens and saying, before I even meet a child and think about what are the tools this child's going to need to maintain self-regulation or possibly gain and then maintain self-regulation, what is the sensory demand in the environment? Because to me, that's the easier fix. If we can look around and say, what is the demand that this child has in terms of processing or taking in sensory information, taking in visual information, taking in olfactory information, taking in touch information? When we're going to be in a busy line or we're going to go to an art festival pre-COVID and there's going to be lots of bumping and touching and bright sun, and what kind of sensory demand is this child's little nervous system experiencing? Because this little nervous system is trying to stay just right. Our nervous
Leslie,
yes.
I actually we have our little fun activity here that
Sure.
we could possibly do right in this little spot,
Sure.
because you're talking about what we need to be looking at for our little ones. So we put together a word cloud, and if you stop sharing, I will share
Sure.
mine and we'll go right back to yours afterwards. So anyone who has their phone, we put together this little word cloud. And what you can do is take your phone and you're going to click on, take a picture of this little Slido and join the comments. And it will bring you right to a little, we'll bring you right to the little word cloud here. And what you're going to do is put in a word that describes you. So what are some ways we as adults self-regulate ourselves?
And what are things that we could think about in the environment that challenge, yeah, or support regulation? Yeah.
Lots of people are taking a walk.
Taking walks, breathing, resting.
Here, let's see. Any more people? We'll give you a little
gum, yes.
Keep going.
Flipping. Finding a quiet place. So Shawn, when we're finding a quiet place, remember as we were looking at those pictures of the classrooms that had so many visuals, we would argue that finding a quiet place is allowing us to decrease the sensory stimulation.
Are there any more? There we go. Keep going.
Warm bath, there's your tactile. Drinking water, we would say, is oral, right? So of course we're hydrating ourselves, but oral is very satisfying. When we close our eyes, we're decreasing the sensory demand, right? So we're going back to those pictures and saying, how can we decrease the work my engine, my nervous system has to do right now? We teach students that we always have the breath. It's a wonderful engine tool. It's a wonderful regulatory tool because you don't have to reach into your backpack and try and remember where your gum is, where you can just use your breath. You always have the option to use your breath. Thinking of happy places would be the same thing.
We'll give it a few more minutes.
And movement, that's that vestibular system, right? That we said that we really respect when we're talking about regulatory tools. Movement and yoga and taking a walk, those are those vestibular and proprioceptive systems that we're using for self-regulation. Exercise.
Great. So it looks like
Walking away from the stimulation, again, that's decreasing the sensory demand. Excellent.
all right. Wow. So we've had about 20 responses and it looked like breathing for most adults was the one they had to do. At the beginning of this, Leslie caught me meditating. So,
Well, and it's interesting because, you know, I think growing up, we've all had an adult say to us when our engine gets high, when our arousal goes up, just take a deep breath. So these tools, these regulatory tools we've had in place, we're just asking us to really put a language framework around them. And ideally, I'm hoping that the audience will take home, and the most important message to me is that we help support self-regulation so we don't have to worry about our arousal state going out of the just right range. So I can go back to sharing.
yes. So now that we're going to think about our little one's nervous system, we realize that we do it as adults. We're going to look at what kind of behaviors we're kind of looking for. What does that diet look like?
Yes. So we're going to be talking about the sensory diet. So we have said first, if we're going to be supporting the children's self-regulation, we first want to look at what is the sensory demand for my student or my child during their busy day, often busy day. What is the sensory demand? Am I going to go to Costco and have a busy visual and sensory experience when we're also going to Hard Rock Cafe for grandma's dinner that night? Or am I going to be really balancing the sensory demand for my child and thinking about that? And then we also think about what we call a sensory diet. And so just as we would not let our children get hungry, we nourish our children at regular times during the day. We also believe that we should not let the sensory system get hungry. And just as a hungry child is not a regulated child, a hungry nervous system is not a regulated nervous system. We know that our nervous system is wired to maintain homeostasis. So we know that if our arousal, our engine starts to drop down or starts to get high, that the nervous system will use tools to try and regulate, to get back to that just right zone. And so we're asking you to think about behaviors that you see. If you have a child who's wiggling at the mealtime table or wiggling during rug time, we would say that that's that little engine, that little nervous system's attempt to self-regulate, an attempt to maintain an optimal arousal to get through dinner. So we know that we're always trying to maintain that self-regulated state, but what we're asking you to do when we think about a sensory diet is don't let that sensory system get hungry. So we don't get to that place where we're wiggling at the dinner table and getting arousal states around us high. So we would say that if you at regular intervals during the day could give the primary sensory systems that we would ask you to think about, is that vestibular system, that movement sense for a child who's growing and integrating the little nervous system. Proprioception, heavy work, is deeply regulating. So we know that heavy work can bring a high engine back to just right and a low engine just back to just right. Vestibular alerts, unless we're using rocking, and that soothes. Oral is another one of our big inputs that we use when we're trying to support regulation. So when we're thinking about intensity of texture, temperature, and flavor, do I want to give my child, if I'm trying to support my child's regulation, do I want to give my child a banana that really is giving minimal feedback when we eat a banana, or a crunchy apple? Do I want to make a sandwich with a piece of bread or a chewy bagel? Do I want to ice up the water bottle so that the water is alerting because it's also icy? What am I doing in terms of movement breaks during the day for my child? What do we do in terms of the visual experience? If my child is bothered by the bright sun, or what are we doing to make sure that we're not challenging self-regulation, but supporting it by looking at the visual experience? So just as these systems are the systems that give us our information so that we can have adaptive responses, we also use them to maintain self-regulation. So I had just a little example here. If we were thinking about what would we mean more about a sensory diet and sensory snacks and sensory meals? This is just an example of what a morning could look like. If we were saying, well, I'm going to really feed that little nervous system from the start. If I can try this on, I'm going to from the start try and be giving rich sensory input. You could be thinking about wheelbarrow walking your child to the breakfast table. You could, if that's not an option, you could have your child get into a bear crawl. Whenever we get out a walk and we get into a 4-point position, we're getting that proprioceptive work that we talked about. We're getting that heavy work into the joints, and it's very regulating. So we can have our child just do some kind of bear walk or wheelbarrow walk to the breakfast table. What are we doing when we come to the breakfast table about textures? Again, do we have cold, crunchy cereal with cold milk? Do we have crunch chewy bagels? Do we put a straw in our yogurt and or a straw in the cereal to suck up that milk? Textures, temperatures, tastes can definitely offer a sensory meal for the child who's trying to maintain regulation. So we may have had a low, oh, Shawn, did you have a comment?
And so could you also mention some sensory diet, some little snacks for our 0 to 3s?
Absolutely. So 0 to 3, we would typically go in with a lot of oral. So we would always be thinking if we were building a little engine, a little engine backpack of things that we want for the younger kids, we would be thinking about oral. So do we have crunchy little snacks? Do we have some kind of a nice little water bottle? We would be thinking about, with that age, you're also thinking more about the sensory setup that we talked about. So we would be making sure that the clothing that we're putting on for the child is very comfortable clothing, that we're not giving a significant tactile demand for the child. So we're thinking about clothing that offers comfort. We're also thinking again about what is the child going to be experiencing in terms of the visual experience. So a lot of it with the younger kids is about quieting the sensory experience, monitoring and quieting the sensory experience. In terms of direct tools for the child, is we'd be thinking about comfortable tools, comfortable clothing, oral tools, and then the child, the 0 to 3 child, can always be invited to move into a pattern of other than walking. So we're perfectly at that age that we can be doing a little old-fashioned crawl or creep. So if we still could be doing that, we could be doing a little crawling game. I remember when my daughter was young, I kept her down for a tremendous amount of time playing crawling games and hide and seek crawling games to make sure that she was getting rich input before we would go out during the day.
Great.
Um, so then if we feel like, okay, we've got a nice little regulated little nervous system, little engine here, but when we're going to have to get in the car, we're going to be taking a ride. And so we've gotten this nice self-regulation, but now our arousal is going to drop because we're in the car. We're not going to have a movement option. Our arousal is going to drop. So we're going to need some car tools. We're not going to be able to do a nice hide and seek crawl game in a car, but what tools can we offer? Well, we can offer for the older child, we can offer gum. Somebody said they use gum as an engine tool. We look at each sensory system and we say, what can we do to provide input to that system? So tactile, can we have some fidgets in the cars? Can we have some toys that the child can be playing with? Visual, can we have a favorite book? Can we have a book that is soothing on an emotional level, that's emotionally regulating to the child? Can we have the snack for the younger child? What are the things that we're going to do when we know, okay, car rides bring our arousal down? How do we support keeping that arousal in a just right place? For the older child, if we're still working hard on keeping that arousal in an optimal state, but it's been challenged in a car, then we're going to be going to school or to an activity. Can we park away from the school and walk in? So, and that can be for the youngest child, that kind of vestibular input is regulating. So you can have just the child who's been in a car or been in a situation where sensory is minimized, that you can definitely use walking a toddler into an environment is a perfectly good tool. and then arriving early and climbing on the play structure. So this was just a real simple little way of showing you how you could set up the morning. And this little nervous system for this child has gotten a lot of rich input if we managed, you know, if we were able to follow through with these steps. Do you have something, Shawn, that you'd like to say?
Yeah, so what are some of the things as parents when we're at home? What are we looking for? How do we become that detective to see if the behavior the child is doing is sensory seeking? Haha.
So you do want to become a sensory detective. You want to do two things. You want to look at what the input is that the child is seeking, and you want to think about when the child is seeking it. Because ideally, again, we've agreed that you're not going to let your child get hungry. You're not going to get that little sensory system, let that sensory system get hungry. So classic example that parents will give me is around the dinner hour. They're trying to organize dinner and their little toddler, or, you know, up until 7 or 8 year olds, is suddenly crashing into the sofa. So we would say, what is that little nervous system? What is that child seeking? Well, they're seeking deep pressure. That's into the tactile system. When we crash, we're seeking deep pressure. We might be getting proprioception if we also kind of climb on the sofa. So we would say, okay, that child is seeking deep pressure, maybe proprioception. How do we redirect it? Some parents will say, I'm fine with them jumping on the sofa if that gets them to a just right engine so they can sit for dinner. Others will say, well, we're going to redirect that and say, we can see you're trying to get your engine just right. Let's go out on the trampoline. I would argue that if you have a little child that's now crashing into the sofa, that little nervous system got hungry, and we needed to catch that nervous system with the sensory meal sooner. So what I would be doing is asking parents or educators as sensory detectives, if you see that predictable patterns, the child is chewing on their shirt, chewing on their toys, doing a lot of oral seeking or deep pressure seeking, vestibular just running around, wah, with a high engine, then we've missed that goal of maintaining self-regulation. And I think we'd all agree that damage control is much harder. So that's where I'd be saying, can we back it up and can we make sure that we get some rich input before we get to that place where we're seeking, where we're doing the seeking? When we're doing significant sensory seeking, it's because we're no longer in an optimal arousal and we're trying to get back to it. And so you do want to offer, you want to redirect that behavior to a more purposeful, especially if the child is running. Pure vestibular is not considered to be a calming input. Vestibular paired with proprioception. So those are those sensory receptors in the joint. So getting those kids out of the walking position, getting them into the bear walk, having them crawl through a cloth tunnel. When you see that sensory seeking behavior, those are all inputs that are going to regulate. But again, I would say try and do that earlier before the child starts seeking. So again, when we're trying to set up for sensory success, what I've learned over the years is that there are some things that are friends to our engine, to our nervous systems, and there are things that are not friends. So familiar, predictable, and expected are all very sensorily friendly, because the nervous system doesn't have to process new information if something is familiar, if something is predictable, expected. That the nervous system has habituated to those inputs, and so the child does not, or adult does not go into a higher arousal with the expectation of something different or unexpected or unpredictable, because they know what to expect, and they know what to expect on a nervous system level. And so they can maintain a self-regulated state. Things that challenge the arousal state, challenge self-regulation, are things that are unfamiliar, unpredictable, unexpected. So on a sensory level, we all know the classic example of somebody coming up from behind and and unexpectedly tapping you can, can be an alerting input to the nervous system. It's not a friendly input. Unpredictable, so changes in the experience of the day, because that child is really not understanding that they're thinking this, but the nervous system is thinking, what is the demand going to be? I've just been told we're going to a new store, or we're going to into a new classroom because our teacher is sick, so we're going to this other classroom. So the little nervous system actually brings us into a higher arousal because we don't know what to expect. So that's the unfamiliar, and then the unpredictable. So, and that even gets into when we're thinking about the self-directed younger child. Often parents will tell me that they feel like there's this time when the children get home that they're free to do what they want to do and just pick their play plan. And that self-direction is often very hard for kids that are working harder to learn how to self-regulate, because there's that unpredictable component. And so if there's just even the layer of structure, what are you going to play today? Are you going to play with your Legos, or are you going to play with your other toy? That layer of structure that's added, that helps a child feel less adrift, less afloat. So, and just that front loading, that setup, just a simple conversation when they're snuggling at bed at night, that tomorrow was going to be our pajama day, so we will play a little bit. Remember, we have these things we can play, and then in the afternoon we might go to the park. And so even the unstructured summer days, you can embed a bit of structure that supports regulation for the child. So again, the regulated child is the child that's there in the moment. That's there, that's the child that's able to organize appropriate emotional responses, balanced behavior that matches the situation at hand. And this is, again, this is just a little bit more clinical if you wanted this, that the child that's able to recognize their level of alertness. So when we're talking about self-regulation, that is that piece where we're now able to monitor. We're now able to say, my engine is running high. And that when you're grinding that coffee, or when you're getting, we're taking me into that store where everybody's bumping each other, or that I had a student once say that when the teacher was drawing a lot on the whiteboard and not erasing it enough, that it was too much to look at. And so that got their engine high. So what I love about the way we support children, especially with the engine program, is that we're trying to give them a little voice. And you can start as young as the toddler to start explaining how certain things can keep us just right. Some things get us a little high, and some things get us a little low through our day.
Leslie,
Yeah,
there is a question from an attendee.
sure.
If a child is always sucking on a cloth, do they need more of a sensory oral diet, or do the other senses help, as with the oral fixation?
So the thinking would be, that's an excellent question. The thinking would be that the system that they're driven to use is the oral system, but enriching the other sensory inputs should help the child's overall regulation. So you want to, if we seek oral, you want to give oral, you want to also maybe give richer oral. So if just the suck is what the child is using, then bump up everything else. Start looking at intensity of flavors. Like I have kids that suck on grapefruit slices, and they use less suck when they're doing that. And then temperatures, and then we talked about textures. But then also, yes, the thinking is, if you do go into the other sensory systems and hit those systems with a degree of intensity, the sucking should quiet. You should be able to see a quieting of the sucking. So again, when we're talking about a regulated child, we are talking about them being able to recognize their level of alertness. And this can be with the population, the age group we're talking about in the simplest terms. That just, it gets my engine high when I wear those pants. I don't like those pants. They don't feel good. And then moderating that sensory input. And they're going to be doing that if they can have that dialogue with you as they pursue their self-regulation. And then we have organized behavioral output. So what we're thinking about is, if we're thinking about, I just think of 3 Ps. So I think of present. When we're talking about present, we're talking about being present on a nervous system level. So we're talking about having homeostasis. So that's that nervous system regulation. And then if we were able to have that, and this, let me step back and give an example I remember from OT school when the professor was talking about a regulated versus dysregulated state. She was talking, and she gave an example of sitting on a bus, and you're on a bus and you're going down a hill very fast, and there's a lot of potholes. And so you're bumping into these potholes and you're going very, very fast. And your nervous system is obviously your vestibular system and your proprioceptive systems have gone into high alert, trying to just keep you upright and just keep you upright and keep you to some degree of balance to maintain your seat in the chair. But if somebody were to say, can you please also now color this picture? Or can you write your name on this piece of paper? If you don't have a nervous system level of regulation, you're not available to do that. So that's that present piece, that we have nervous system homeostasis. If we have nervous system homeostasis, then we should be able, the next step would be able to have some degree of participation. And often my little friends who are working harder on their regulation have more of a sensitive nervous system. They stay in this participation place for a while. So that participation is more of a observer role. So I'm regulated enough that I can follow my little peer group around. If the children go and get in line, I'll go and get in line. If I can look over, and if kids are coloring, I'll color. And so I really am in the observer role who's following. And I'm regulated enough that I can participate as an observer, as a follower. When we get to a point of overall self-regulation that we can actually then be a processor, then we would say that we have a nice functional little nervous system and behavioral outcomes. And processing would be, I'm learning, I'm experiencing, I'm learning, I'm not following, I'm learning, I'm contributing. I can have really appropriate self-directed emotional outcomes. I can be joyful about what I've just done, what my processing participation has been. I can experience joy. I can experience curiosity. I can experience all of these emotional and behavioral outcomes that that you get when you're an active participant, when you're an active participant in your process. So what Shawn was hoping to help everybody think about for today, and I help you think about for today, is how do you get that little nervous system as present as it can be, so it can move into participation. For the sensitive nervous system, it's going to be a journey, and we participate and then we process. But we really do need to, think about how we don't let that little nervous system ever get on that bus during the day, as best as we can. As best as we can. How can we take care of the nervous system needs the way we do in terms of nutritional needs?
That's awesome. So I have one more word cloud, and we're going to ask our participants if they care to share some of the behaviors that they see looking through this sensory lens that we've just talked about. We're going to see what are some of the things that they have noticed with their little ones. And we're going to give our interpreter like 3 minutes, 4 minutes of rest. So I'm going to put this next word cloud up. You guys can go ahead and put them in, and then we'll look them over in about 3 minutes. Ready? There we go.
Shawn, is your preference? Oh, yes, just I think because we are letting Juan rest, so I think I'm not going to comment right now.
Right, yes.
Okay.
Wow.
I'm not sure Juan saw your note to him, Shawn.
It's okay. So wow, we're gonna come back here. Our interpreter is ready. I'm
Can I
gonna
punch
stop
in?
sharing this. This is a lot of activity, but the most common one we see is chewing on cloves.
Well, I saw a few things. So yes, so absolutely, if we're looking at oral seeking, chewing on clothes, chewing on toys, we do want to redirect that. And again, if you're comfortable introducing the just the simplest of engine frameworks, redirecting in a positive way is really important. So to be able to say, even to the youngest child, I can see you're trying to get your engine just right. Here's your water bottle, or here's a little crunchy snack. So when we look at sensory seeking, we want to think about whether or not it's how purposeful or disorganized it might be. So is it purposeful? Is it disorganized? So do we go out and jump on the trampoline when we want input, or are we just chewing on our shirt? And then we also are always thinking about how we're going to move through tool use, and we're going to be trying to support our kids in understanding that we want to make it as predictable and as expected. We talk a lot about expected behaviors. So chewing on your shirt isn't necessarily expected behavior. So those unexpected behaviors are the behaviors that we would redirect to a more expected engine tool.
And
So
Leslie, sorry,
yeah.
there's one more
I was
question.
just going to read that one. Go ahead, Gabe.
What do you see particular to children with hearing deficits as it pertains to sensory processing?
So I don't work a lot. I did years ago. I worked with students with hearing loss, and but I do know that there can be certainly seeking in terms of the vestibular and proprioceptive inputs because of the balance piece. But I think that in general, I think that when the general thinking would be is that you want to look at the individual child, because we really, even within a hearing or non-hearing community, every sensory system is different. And so one system might, we might have, like we saw in the all of the feedback, we might have an oral seeker or a movement seeker, and so it really can vary. It absolutely varies. So what I would say is, again, be that sensory detective and look at what your child is seeking, and think about whether or not what they're seeking is expected. Some of the things that I'm thinking about that popped up on the word cloud was a lot of using vocalization, singing, angry outbursts, verbal outbursts, loud noises. I think there you want to think about what is the trigger, right? If we're trying to maintain self-regulation and we have a child who's either singing, that's oral. We would argue singing and making those sounds, that's oral. I would go in with oral input. Yelling, when somebody said talking, when I'm talking to an adult, my child yells, that child might be telling you that there's something overstimulating. If we're looking through a sensory lens, there's something overstimulating about you having this conversation. If we're looking through a behavior lens, we're saying this child is wanting your attention. But if we're agreeing today to look through a sensory lens and rule that out, then we'd be saying what's going on with this interaction that is causing my child to get dysregulated. I did also, Shawn, want to just mention a couple other things. I saw that somebody had put ripped paper. And then again, if we are talking about leaning in to what our children are showing us, I think, I have a lot of kids that are cutters. So the kids that would be ripping paper and are working on their self-regulation, I let them have paper to cut. And sometimes they can even be doing the cutting for their teachers as they get older. But I've had 3 preschoolers and 2 kindergartners last year cutting right through their year, and it completely supported their regulation. They just would have different pieces of papers and different cutting activities. And what we know is that active participation supports regulation.
And there is one more question.
Sure.
The identification of traits between autism / PPD or experiences with hearing concerns is close. Is it best to have a qualified evaluator or someone to discuss the circumstances with the unique qualities?
So I think you want to talk to somebody if you're thinking about whether or not your child is suffering from or struggling with differences in how they're using their sensory information. I think you want to go with somebody who has it's called the Sensory Integration and Practice certification. So it's called a SIP certification. And that I have that certification, that certification takes again a very, very deep dive into what's happening with the sensory system. So to me, I think that's where I would be going, is I would be finding an occupational therapist that is SIP certified in your area.
To add to that, I think a lot of times we have our children who are being evaluated who are not well versed in either deaf culture or are fluent in sign language. And so a lot of the time we make efforts to make sure that when we do have those evaluations, that there is someone that is available that is fluent in the child's language, so we do
Yeah.
get accurate information. And I
Yeah.
think that's what you're saying. I think we have a hard stop at 11, so I would like to thank you. I think we're working on the sensory foundation is like a key to a sensory success. So when the sensory foundation is not processing correctly, it's unstable and it impacts our development and self-regulation, and that includes our social emotional development. I think the most important part that I'm coming away with is that in every sensory processing challenges, we indeed have to be a detective for our children and seek out kind of what they're doing and try to provide them with that diet.
And I would add to that, Shawn, that I would say that, you know, managing your own self-regulation is a life skill. So I would invite parents and educators and the guests, I would invite them all to think about what are the tools that you use through your day to maintain your regulation? And what are the choices you make? I went to Costco once and I'll never go again. Then I went to IKEA once and I'll never go again. So what are the choices that we make even as adults to support our regulation? And we'll be then better prepared. It is a life skill to be able to self-regulate, especially in this valley. So I would invite parents to think about their own regulation and they'll be better prepared to support their child's regulation.
Fantastic. So with that, we are going to close this beautiful webinar. I want to thank you on behalf of CEID for sharing this wealth of information. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
I want to let our CEID community know that afterwards, we will be sending out the PowerPoint for you and a survey to fill out at the end. So if you could fill out a survey, send it back so we can be sure that we're getting the right seminars and webinars for you, we would really appreciate it. And thank you for attending. We appreciate it. And thank you, Juan.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.